Hi, everyone. We will start in a couple of minutes. We'll just wait for people to come in drips and drabs, and then we'll get going. Okay, let's start now. Welcome to this Agrarian Change webinar organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS University of London. I'm Jens Lerche from SOAS, and I'll be chairing this session in which Kirsten Appendini will present on land markets in rural Mexico in the 21st century, the effect of the 1992 counter-reforms on common property. I'm also joined by two co-organizers, Sreya Sinha from University of Reading and Enrique Castagnon here from SOAS. You can find the full program of our webinar and seminar series on our website, Agrarian Questions. Before we start, let me highlight a few participation guidelines. Please keep your microphone off, except when you're taking part in the discussion, of course. You can raise questions and comments in the chat anytime you want to. That's also the case if you've joined us through our YouTube live stream. In addition to that, in the Q&A session that follows the presentation, those in the webinar can also ask live questions. Simply use the raised hand function, and if that doesn't work for some reason, flag your hand, or in other ways let us know that you want to ask a question. And of course, when asking a question or making a comment, please be considerate and respectful. Finally, we're going to record both the audio and video of the session, so if you do not wish to be recorded, simply don't use your audio and video. It is now time to welcome today's speaker, Kirsten Appendini. Kirsten is a researcher at the Program for Interdisciplinary Studies at El Colegio de Mexico, Mexico City. She has a long career focusing on rural Mexico concerning peasant agriculture, agricultural development and policies, food studies, land tenure, and agrarian institutions. She has published several books and articles in Mexico and internationally, including in Journal of Agrarian Change, and collaborated with international organizations, mainly UN agencies, including 3 years at the FAO in Rome. Let me also just mention that after Kirsten's presentation, we have asked Christabel Kay to be a discussant on the presentation. And I'll return to that after the presentation. Because with this brief introduction, I will now hand over to you, Kirsten, for the next hour, or up to 55 minutes to be precise, for you to present on land markets in rural Mexico in the 21st century, the effects of the 1992 counter-reforms on common property. Over to you, Kirsten.
Thank you. And first of all, thanks to the Journal of Agrarian Studies, its editors, and particularly to Jens, also to Cristobal K, and to Enrique, who has helped me on the more logistic things. This is a very nice great opportunity for me to share some of my recent work with a global audience. I already see some of, I recognize, hi Ramukar, and it's going to be very interesting to have feedback from you all in a discussion which goes beyond my Mexican colleagues. So the subject of my talk today, which Jens has already presented, refers to the evolution of land markets on collective property rights in Mexico after the radical 1992 reforms of the Agrarian Law, which has ruled collective property rights in what is named the ejidos and comunidades. The narrative or data I present is based on a vast multidisciplinary research project we carried out, and the team did 7 case studies in different regions of Mexico, focused on distinct problematic issues concerning different cases of land transactions. And I'm happy to see my colleague and one of the authors of this book, Clara Salazar. No, now she hit herself again, but she's here. The problem here is that we chose case studies with different problematics and issues concerning these land transactions, which are all taking place in a complex institutional framework as property rights and laws changed and have 30 years ago, and it's still very complex to understand and know what is going on in Mexico's countryside. I just gave a very brief comments on the background. I think many of you know that Mexico in 1992 reformed its land legislation. It was a part of a constitutional reform in the Article 27 and the Agrarian Law. So from 1917 to 92, under agrarian reform, 70 years, 51% of Mexico's total land area was distributed to peasants and organized under the collective tenures that I mentioned, called ejido comunidad. However, in this talk, I will refer to the ejido. There are very slight difference in the property rights between ejidos and comunidades. And also, I don't want to complicate my talk. And also the ejidos covered 85% of the collective area in Mexico. So what is an ejido? Well, here is a diagram of a typical ejido. You have, first of all, number 2 is the land that is used for agriculture, and this scheme is official. The ejido has to register the land distribution and the rights in the agrarian register, which I will talk about later. So you have number 2, where you have agricultural land, and this is mostly parceled individually by family, the ejidatario, and worked by the ejidatario and his family. Next to it, number 3 are the common lands, which are for the use of the ejidatarios and his families and people, and the assembly can decide if people living in the ejido community may have rights to the use of the common lands, which differs from one ejido to another. We have the 1A, which is the residential zone. The houses are there of the population, including ejidatarios and other called vecindados, that the neighbors, if you want to translate. And 1B is a small plot that is also collected and used for special projects collect, like the women's agro-industrials can have a project there, or the young people in the ejido, the school can have a little garden or a little plot there for experimenting and so on. So next, please, next, please, Enrique. So how have the rights to these lands, different types of land, changed with the law, from before 92 to after 92? Well, the plots for agriculture priorly during 70 years could not be sold, leased, sharecropped, or subdivided. After the law, and it's still, you have to think that this after the law is not just a few years ago. I remember the big project some of us participated in, reforming the ejido, and in 94, 95, 96, we thought we were going to look at a lot of changes, and there were no, but that was not the case. And even 30 years after, we still have to remind, look at what has happened, and sometimes things have not really happened. That's what so after 92, the plots could be sold, they could lease, sharecrop, etc. But, and this is important because this is one of the points that is not respected in the landmarks even today, is they cannot be subdivided. The common lands cannot be sold or leased, and the access to natural resources is, besides the ejidatarios and their family, is decided by the ejido assembly, and as I said, varies from one place to the other. After 92, the commons cannot be sold or leased. Another important point that is complex as to what is going on in the fields. They have, of course, access to the natural resources, and the same, the assembly decides to people who are not ejidatarios and in their family can use these lands. The governance of the ejido is the assembly. The ejidatarios have a right to vote, but non-ejidatarios may participate in the assembly, but they have not the right to vote. And today we have the same rule, which means that many of the people that are now living in an ejido community, even though they are not have land rights, are excluded from decision making. This includes women, even the spouses of the ejidatarios, the new generations, and people who have moved in and lived there. They have no rights to decide on the ejidatario processes or business, etc. There's another form, but I won't go into that. Junta de pobladores, but it really doesn't work. But that would be longer explanations. What is important on the governance related to the common lands is that the ejido can now change the use of the commons, and they can say the commons or part of the commons is going to be destinated to agricultural land. And when this happens, it can be parceled, and then it can go into the land markets. And another very important figure is that the ejido can now do joint ventures with external capital. They can lease to not to the forest logger, that's to a tourist project, or to exploring a common resource there. They can lease the land for 30 years, and they can renew the lease, which means they actually can control that land. The next, please. So even though that the former law was very strict about the rights and the prohibition of land transfers. The land transfers were on the ground, were very common. And there's a lot of literature on that. And based on what they did was they would translate, they would rent, they would share crop, and all this was based on local agreements accepted informally by the members of an ejido. And this was a strong argument for the 92 reformers to advocate for changing the agrarian law and liberating the constraints on the land transaction. So, followed by the institutional neoliberal reforms, of course, sponsored by the World Bank and based on the new institutionally of property rights school. And this happened in many places of the world. And here are my colleagues would be the experts to discuss this with. The aims of Mexico also embarked on this liberalization with the 92 reforms. The aims of the reforms were, as you see here on the screen, a security of tenure. It all goes, it all is backed up on the property rights theory. Security of tenure, comprehending a bundle of rights, have individual plots for agriculture, rights to common land, natural resources, pasture, forests, etc., rights to an urban plot for residents. This would be secured once they were registered in the Agrarian Register. Also, an important aim was part of the discourse for justification was security of property rights, and the possibility of selling and leasing would prompt investment in order to increase productivity of agriculture and have viable plots used for economics of scale. And of course, the neoliberal technocrats were thinking about big investors, entrepreneurial and commercial agriculture, and hence increasing productivity and the national output, which the agriculture sector had been in a crisis. And also what I already mentioned, allowed joint ventures with non-ejidatario investors to explore the resources in common land. And finally, enable the autonomy and governance of the ejido, meaning that the ejido could now decide for themselves what they would want to do. Formerly, they were under the domain of the Ministry of Reform, of Agrarian Reform, which was closed down with the reforms. Okay, next, please. Enrique, we're changing. Thank you. So at the same time, now that the reform ministry was closed, there was a new set of institutional frame. First of all, there was a certification and titling program as also sponsored. I think it was mainly paid for or backed by the World Bank, not paid for loans from the World Bank. It was called PROCEDE, well, I don't know if I want to translate, program for certification and titling in ejidos and comunidades. This program was implemented from 93, 96, and we'll look at its results shortly. Then there was also established the National Agrarian Register, which I will refer to in the RAN. And there was established an agrarian attorney, the Procuraduría Agraria, which would take care of all the problematics of certification, titling, also disputes, and also be like the institution that would try to mediate conflicts, complaints, etc. If this did not act and also be counselors to the ejidos, if problems were not solved by what do you say, by agreements, they would go to the newly established Agrarian Courts, the Tribunales Agrarios, which there are 52 regional ones in the country today. This means that all that corresponds to registration, conflicts, solving conflicts, has an institutional frame only for ejidas and comunidades. But of course, in Mexico, there's also a judiciary frame for the civil institution. There's a national register for private property, including rural property, which does not have much attention in our work and in reality. And I think that's a big topic and an important abandoned topic that we should also try to work on a bit more. And of course, there are the civil courts for land conflicts and civil courts in general, which also treat land conflicts in the civil courts if you have a private property. And finally, lately, only maybe a decade or so ago, the indigenous rights to the land territory is implemented in Article 4 of the Constitutions. But what land concerns, the experience, very short experience with land conflicts, going into being treated by the courts and the attorney, have now several cases that were to the International Labor Organization Convention 169, or defending indigenous rights. Okay, so will you please the next one? Well, okay, just a brief comment before I look into this. However, it is important that we underline and understand that the 92 Agrarian Law was not a result of a straightforward privatization project, according to the new institutional economics. The reform was the outcome of a complex debate among different stakeholders in Congress, namely, well, in the civil society and then formally in Congress. Namely, we had on one side the neoliberal government technocrats, and on the other, the peasant organizations and part of civil society, many academics involved, which were then one of the historical pillars of the rural party, the PRI, no longer is that. But anyway, the president then was Carlos Salinas, who was committed to opening Mexico's economy. And he could not afford at that time, 92, to ignore the demands of the organized peasantry in the wake of signing NAFTA, the trade agreement with the US and Canada, which was signed in 94. So there was critical mass there of discussions and positions. The result then was a complex compromise of giving ejidatarios and comuneros security in the possession of their land. And that was a discourse of the government. You're going to be better off, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, open up ejido land and its resources to capital agents, which would also be positive for the ejidatarios in the discourse. Okay, so what are the results of this program? I think I mentioned, yes, I mentioned it, the certification and titling program Procede. Well, it was successful on paper because up to 97 ejidos were certified by the end of 96, and by a few years a follow-up. So in 91, before the certification and before the change of law, I give you here are the numbers that you can so that we can have an idea of what has happened. And what has happened is that the pessimistic thoughts, the pessimistic discourse of the neoliberal and the optimistic or this opinion of what happened, there were many people opposite to the reform could say this is going to be the disappearance of the peasantry in Mexico. And no, that didn't happen. We see that there are a few more nucleus agrarias in Mexico in 2020. Of course, it changes in time, but I'm taking the former and latest data. There is an increase in ejidatarios and comuneros, even though land distribution stopped in 92. And this is because, well, let me just finish this. And there is a new population with rights to a plot, but not the full ejidatario rights, which over 500,000. And the registered population with right to a plot and would be in the first place to have rights to land if rights were open or divided or sold within the ejido. Well, why are there more ejidatarios and comuneros and in the ejidos and comunero communities? Well, one reason is, of course, people didn't move out. And the second reason is that probably with the pass of the certification program, which validated plots that were subdivided at that time, that was the moment that you could register legally a plot that was subdivided, and also land on the commons, which was used for agriculture, changed its use. That can explain that we have more subjects as with property, with land rights, okay? But if you look at the land use, we also see that from 91, the 91 is a agrarian census data, has slightly increased, well, over 1 million. And this is the same reason, I would say, of land having been registered as plot, and common lands, which has land on commons has decreased, which probably has passed or was passed at the moment of the program certification program, and perhaps later on if the ejidatarios have changed the formal use of lands, which means that it's clear that the campesinos have not disappeared. The ejidatarios have kept onto the land, and I could go into a little bit more detail if I have time or in the questions and answers. The result is that from now at present 2020, official data from the Agrarian Registry shows that only 5.1% of ejido and comunidad land has been privatized in these last 30 years. Okay, so next one, please. However, official data does not correspond to what is happening within ejido land transactions. Field research and case studies, not only what we did, but in the literature, of course, that assesses that land markets have thrived, there have been sales, leases, share covering joint ventures in the whole country, and transactions among ejidatarios and other inhabitants of the ejido among them, but also with outside agents like individuals or business groups in corporate business. And this is based on, within the ejidatarios, mostly in agriculture, on common trust and the norms that had all been followed prior to 92, where you could not do these transactions, but they were done anyway. And with outsiders, it's a more complex, and that I will show in some of the case studies that I will present. So why are, you can see, for example, here, Baja California and Baja California Sur, which have large stretches of beaches, are the ones that have mostly been privatized on the commons. You can also see Sonora, which has is on the North Pacific coast with beautiful areas, but also with agri-industry. The commons have been privatized. And Yucatan, which the one of the three states in the peninsula of Yucatan on the Caribbean, has also privatized a lot. So next, please. Will you please give me the next slide? Okay. Well, the main reason, making it very summarized, is that the complexity of formal legalization, product of this mixed mass of the final law protecting the campesinos and trying to liberate. That's my thesis or whatever. So rural population, 30 years after the reforms, are still not familiar with the 92 law and its procedures for registration concerning land transactions. But it's not only the not understanding by the peasantry, but also there are institutional failures in the agrarian bureaucracy, especially at the regional and local level. The ones from the attorney office would be the middlemen, and even in the courts. And this leads to inefficiency in transaction and high transaction costs in the process of legalization to be registered in that land. Also, formal regulations and procedures confront the social and cultural norms and understanding of rights at the local level. I mean, 70 years doing the things and still not understanding is also because there's a confrontation of these vernacular, established, known ways of doing things. And of course, there is a huge, in many cases, within the asymmetric power relations between actors involved in land transactions and onto the registration. Next, please. So in conclusion, the ongoing process of land and resource transfers has not necessarily conformed to the legal procedures, as I have underlined, designed by the titling program registered in the agrarian registers. The result then is a complex and messy reality concerning the agrarian tenure situation. There are informal sales, disputes within families, dispute between ejidos and de facto control of the national, international business corporations or agents on ejido resources. This is widespread. So the above factors have led to different strategies and conflicts between agents in land markets, solved between either the individuals, others being arbitrated within the ejido assembly, and also there's a practice of going to the civil of, for example, the notaries to validate transactions though they're not part of the legal procedures in the agrarian jurisprudence. But sometimes judges may look at them and have them take them into account. Particularly, this happens when transactions are with outside actors. However, this has not necessarily led to formal registration. Also, a great number of disputes have been brought to the agrarian tribunes at the regional level. I just saw some data from the agrarian tribunes in which indeed their statistics of 30 years say that there are over 1 million cases in the courts, and I don't know how many unsolved. So in order to illustrate and discuss what is happening on the ground, I will not now discuss 3 examples from case studies, okay? And here's where we have done these case studies. In Chihuahua in the north, or even though I point to it, I can't point to it on the screen. But anyway, yeah, I can, I just didn't do it. Chihuahua in the north, there's this tourist area I want to point to. The peri-urban city of Mexico City, that we have a case study. We have studied 2 cases in the state of Veracruz. I'm not going to talk about them. And also in Oaxaca. I commend what happened there if we have time, or if we do it in the questions and answers. We have the peninsula de Yucatan, a very violent case in the Caribbean on the beach fronts, which I'm not talking about today, but here we have, I will present first this case in which we look at what has happened between the indigenous Maya population and a group of farmers, entrepreneurial farmers, the Mennonites. So first, let's look at Opelchen. If you will pass on to the next, please. Okay. The Opelchen is a municipality of Opelchen in the state of Campeche in the peninsula, as I said. And I call this de facto privatization. A little background: land formerly served, excuse me, just a little more about who are the actors in. When processed the registration program, it came to the municipality in the mid-90s. Most of the ejidos there decided to only certify the ejido boundaries and keeping most of the land within the ejido as common lands. This was the traditional way of farming in Yucatan, and it was among the Mayas. And even though there were plots, and the plots were assigned to families, etc., but formally it was common lands. And while keeping the majority then on being legal under the common use. So this would, theoretically, this would mean that these lands were protected from being leased or sold, etc. But this was, it was on the ground, no barrier for transactions. So in the 1990s, a group of Mennonites, Protestant sect, which came historically from Canada, it settled in Chihuahua, the northern state of Chihuahua, in the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century. But there was a group moving down to Campeche, to the peninsula, in the 1990s. And they then began to expand. Some of the original land was given permission by federal lands, and the government assigned it to the Mennonite farmers. But they have been expanding their activity, and they are the ones who are now mainly leasing and renting, or so say, and buying land. But according to the formal registration of land transaction in the ejidos of Opelchen, according to 2016 data for the municipalities, show that only 2 ejidos had registered land sales and only 10 ejidos had registered leasing contracts. During field work, our team found otherwise. Land transactions were very common in the ejidos. And estimates show that from the field team working there, that 25 to 75% of ejido land is rented or leased in ejidos. Most transactions are private and verbal, and the less are approved by the ejido authority. Not even that. In a few cases, the partners went to a notary to kind of legalize these transactions. But normative and local social practices is what guarantees the security of transactions, permanent or temporal, and it is recognized by the parties involved in a community. Since this is very, very important for both partners, I forgot to mention, which you probably know, that the ejidatarios are Mayan maize farmers in the traditional milpa way, and they're also beekeepers. The Peninsula of Yucatan is the most important honey exporters of Mexico. But that was this was a footnote. I'll go back to what I was saying. Nonetheless, it's the social and cultural practices that give security to both partners. But nonetheless, if this is sustained on trust and mutual agreements, it is not so that all the social and cultural practices weren't sustained. For example, the peasant residents in the ejidos with no land rights, but had formerly been allowed to the use of these rights. This was a tradition and a customary right on the farmer plots, on the commons. These were farmers, peasants who grew subsistence crops and lived off this. But this, in many cases, this right was taken from them because now land had another use and another value and were sold and leased, both within the ejida but mainly to the Mennonites neighbors. Okay. And I also want to mention another footnote, which is that the Mennonites are big commercial farmers, very well organized, using high technology to grow soybeans and hybrid maize for the market, and they're very successful. They are so technological users that even there are cases in which they spray these fields with herbicides and fertilizers on planes, by plane. So, okay. This was perhaps the most, what would I say, smooth example of transactions and mutual agreement and peaceful living between two very different farming neighbors. And now I will go to the next case, which is in the mountains of Chihuahua, the northern state I pointed to. Well, here, the area is the territory of indigenous people, the Raramuri, which have lived there for centuries and were granted a land to ejidos in the early, not after the first agrarian reform in the 30s, I guess, which was, this area is covered with vast forest, which has always been disputed between the Raramuri and loggers, Mexican loggers. And, but that's another story. When a railroad from the capital city of Chihuahua to the Pacific coast was built in the mid-20th century, small-scale tourism began to develop. This is a land which is very apt for tourism. It's high mountains. It has a beautiful canyon which goes through the territory, the canyon, the Barranca del Cobre. It has no more, less spectacular, I would say, that with the Colorado Canyon. No, I haven't been to the Colorado Canyon, but this was a beautiful place. And so the small tourism would begin to develop a kind of small cabins, small settlements by the Raramuri and some of the Mestizo population. But after the 92, when this land could legally be available for market transactions, capital interests in tourism, not only private, but also the state and the local government, have penetrated the region with big projects such as an adventure park, hotels, and an airport. In case of this region, then, the complexity of the context is much more messy than in the case of Opelchen, where farmers with the farmers. Because here we have a diversity of social and cultural background of the actors involved and the deep economic, social, and political inequality amongst them. So here, and what I want to show in this diagram is that we have we studied that, as one of my colleagues studied the region in the Raramuri territory. And here in this tourist area and dispute, we took the example of an ejido. So here we have the ejido, we have a majority of Raramuris, and we have a minority of mestizos. But the mestizos dominate and control the ejido assembly. Within this ejido, there is a settlement of pure Raramuris, in which some are ejidatarios here, belonging here, and others are not. Next to this ejido, and very next to the settlement, there is a region of hotels, and it's near to the adventure park, which mostly goes over the limits a little bit, but are neighbors to the ejido. And it is not clear yet if it is fully privatized because of these complex processes, or it is leased from the ejido. And all this is the forest, which would supposedly all represent the territory of the Raramuri. So this is very overlapping, complex institutional case. Okay. So this, as a consequence of this complexity and of all the different actors and interests in this region, in this case, disputes over land within ejidos and outside agents confront diverse significance and understanding of the land and the forest. And let me just mention that forests on common lands cannot be changed for another use by the new law, by the 92 law also. It cannot be parceled, it cannot be sold, etc. So, and for example, we have the understanding of the rights to the land and forest, and the Raramuri considered their territory, and they have their ways to defend those rights vis-a-vis the local and external agents who try to encroach upon it. Within this economic, social, and cultural environment, land transactions, conflicts, negotiations are intertwined in this complex web. Also mobilizations, expropriations, irregular and illegal agreements, corruption, bribery, as well as legal struggles resting on local, national, and international jurisprudence. And I cannot really go much into the details because you can also read our book. But okay, let me take a break. So, when the process regulation or title certification and program came to the ejidos, to this ejido in particular, I explained that I think as I already said what happened, so I will go to what happened with the disputes and the conflicts. So this settlement close to the hotel area and the adventure plan made a demand and a complaint that it was bothering it was contaminating water sources and it was obstruction their trails for the forest to move around. This caused an internal dispute between the Raramuri ejidatarios, both here and in the ejido, with the mestizo ejidatarios, okay, as I said, dominated the assembly, and had formally approved the lease of some of the territory. The entrepreneur then dealt with the assembly, mestizos, and offered a payment to the ejidatarios in order to accept the deal of renting. But this population settlement did not agree to this decision, and they said it was not legal, did not following the correct procedure in the assembly, which is to have a 75% of the ejidatarios in the assembly voting to change an agreement. And of course, this often is not complied to. And so there was no solution at this. The settlement kept fighting in the courts. And in this case, it is not only the group that is affected, but there's a whole support of NGOs and civil society in the NGOs and lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that usually happens. They have costs, they have to have information, they have to have the legal law knowledge. So there is a civil society and NGOs that has supported this kind of problems and very active in this region. The conflict was also in the court, was also the judges finally, because of the work of the NGOs and of course the Raramuris, they sought help, support also with the indigenous rights clause of the ILO Convention 169. And this was important because finally the judge, one of the judge in the case, not only related to the different actors' position, including the traditional norms and rights of this population, but they finally referred also to the ILO Convention, which is one of the first examples in Mexico in the Agrarian Courts. The conflict was finally solved by negotiations and final agreement. The state government offered its support to an eco-tourist project, which this community had been wanting, and they were benefited with this project, but the rest of the ejidatarios received no compensation. So there was still a dispute going on, but that was the end of this problem. So this case,
Kirsten, you got 5 more minutes.
oh
so,
really? Then I'm
yes.
gonna miss the last case, which
Well,
is Clara Salazar's, but
okay.
I can comment on that. Okay, so will you go on to the next? Okay, so the resolution I already talked about, and I think you can skip it. I don't know if I have time for another case, which is about well, you just put the slide on, please, the next one. Okay, it's so my audience can see what it was about. The former, please. You can skip this one. You can skip this one. No, go back, please, Enrique. On the peri-urban, the next, forward. Okay, so this is ejido in a peri-urban metropolitan area of Mexico City. Very small ejidatarios who live on subsistence agriculture of our income, scattered plots they rented to poor or sold to poor non-ejidatarios. But then a private developer building low-income housing was interested in the land. The ejidatarios were convinced to enter to a joint venture and contribute the land on the commons, while the developer did all the rest of the business. But the ejidatarios elected a council of 5 to represent the ejido in this joint venture. And this is the next slide, please, tells you about why this was a joint ventures. The council representing the ejido turned their back on their fellow ejidatarios. There was no accountability. They probably got messed up in corruptions with the developer. We can't prove that, but Clara can comment on this. And when the developer started working and began to destroy the marginal houses on the land, then the ejidatarios, member of the ejido, really became very angry, of course, and they mobilized to blocking the entrance to the machinery and the work. After years, I think 3-4 years, if I remember right, they had already put a demand in the Agrarian Courts, and it took long, as these cases usually do, when finally the developer could not go further in his project and filed for bankruptcy and returned the land to the ejido. So this could be a win case for the ejidatarios legally, but it was not the case because the ejidatario lost economically. They invested a lot of money in the whole process, in the case, etc. And they also lost socially because the social coherence of the ejido organizations would have prevailed. Until then, completely broke up. So I'm sorry that I had to rush through this. So let's just look at the final remarks. Within the 1992 reforms, ejido land legally became a commodity. Before that, it was a use value and base of livelihoods for the peasants. Hence, land acquired exchange value for investment in commercial agriculture, tourism, urban development, and also for exploitation of other natural resources such as energy, etc. We can talk about that if you are interested. And also the reform to introduce an ambiguous and contradictory concept of ejido property, as well as the procedures in land transactions and the final procedures for registration legally. This results in a profound rupture between what is defined as correct in legal terms. We ask, what is socially seen and what is fair and just? And this is kind of discussion that we open to our readers and our audience. I mean, what is legal? What is illegal? What is legitimate? What is not legitimate? According to the context that people, different actors, understand these terms. Okay, so now I just want to show you the acknowledgements of this project, and of course my recognition of the project coordinator, Gabriela Torres Masuera, of my fellow researchers, among them Sara. What, did I not put your name, Clara? I messed up, I'm sorry, okay. It was very unfortunate it was your name. No, here you are. I just didn't put it correctly. And also, well, we have a publication. The financer was the Consejo Nacional de Ciencias y Tecnología, right? And the institutions involved were the Colegio de México and the CSS Peninsular, where Gabriela Torres works. Thank you so much. How did I do then? Did I go over a lot?
No, you're totally fine. Thanks so much, Kirsten. That was absolutely riveting. And so both what you summed up in the final slide with this very contradictory concept of ejido communal ownership, which I'm sure we will be discussing, but also the difference between the official scenario and what is actually going on. But as I mentioned briefly, I have sort of I've asked my good colleague Cristobal K to be the one that discusses the paper. So I will keep mum for a little while. First, though, let me just introduce Cristobal to those that do not know him. Chris is a professor emeritus at the ISS. He's also an emeritus editor of the Journal of Agrarian Change. He sadly decided to retire from the journal less than a year ago, but it's great that we can still draw on him when we have to. He is a very influential specialist in the fields of rural development and development theory, with particular reference to Latin America. He has worked on this he's published on this since the 1970s, and he still does. So it is with pleasure that I will hand over to you, Chris, for brief comments and questions on the paper.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Jens. And thank you above all to Kirsten for a very interesting presentation on a key subject in Mexican agrarian issues and more generally. And I congratulate the whole team of this project because of this disjuncture between the official figures and the official data and so on, and this messy reality, which of course always existed in one way or another. But with this 1992 change of the Constitution, Article 4, the reality became even messier. Even more complex, and created, from what you say, even more conflicts in the countryside. And I congratulate you above all because one needs to do the field work to find out really what happens. I mean, in some other countries which have better statistics and so on, you can more or less, these statistics more or less reflect this reality. But in this case, you really need to have the case studies, and especially in a country like Mexico, which has huge regional differences. The region next to the United States is very different to the region in Chihuahua, which is next to the Central American countries and so on. So it's good that you need to have different case studies in order to show this complexity of this very complex situation in itself. So that's one thing, you know, the importance to do the field work and to show the different regional differences, because this law, of course, has different consequences in different regions. While your thesis was that they didn't accomplish, the neoliberals didn't accomplish, so to speak, the aims which they had, but also the forecast of the left, so to speak, of the critics also, you know, we all thought that there would be a process of privatization, land would be bought by these agribusiness and so on, and that capitalism and everything would be commodified. But as you say, it is not the case. It's done in a particular Mexican way in which, of course, as you mentioned, much land has changed, but in a different way, you know, through leases, through informal networks, and so on and so forth, which exactly the reason why it creates also conflicts. But certainly some of the aims have been achieved. Some capitalists come in, you know, and the use of the land has changed and so on. When we, in sort of this political economy approach, we always tend to emphasize very much not only which happens with property and who owns what and what do they do with it, as you have analyzed, but also very much the process of social differentiation. But usually when we discuss social differentiation, we see it within, let's say, within the peasant community or within the peasantry. You know, you have created the middle peasantry, the rich peasantry, and the wage workers. That's very much the focus of the analysis of social and economic differentiation. But what I found interesting in this case, and where I would like you perhaps to say a few things on it, is this differentiation between the ejidos. Because you have ejidos, you mentioned, which have access to natural resources, ejidos which have access to beaches and to tourism ventures. You have access to ejidos which are near the US border and which have the advantage of the nearness for vegetable and fruit exports and so on. So, and ejidos with you know, rich other natural resources, you mentioned, like forestry, silver, and so on. So there the question comes, who captures the rent? I suppose in these agreements, these lease agreements of 30 years and so on, somebody pays somebody. This investor, this joint venture, pays the ejido. And then how is this funding distributed within the ejidatarios? That's one question. And to what extent can we see that some ejidos have become very rich, or very much those rent income is actually rent income, you know, that the natural, you know, the benefit from this national rent, and others ejidos which have not this advantage, which are on poor lands and so on. So other than a differentiation, not only within the ejidos, but also now between the ejidos, and which creates new problems of equity and so on in relation to the agrarian reform project, you know, which is obviously is partly to yeah, and you mentioned all the conflicts also then between different indigenous groups, between the indigenous groups and the mestizos and so on. Anyway, these are sort of my key questions. Is mainly what happens to this rent and how does it affect the differentiation process between ejidos and within ejidos? So what happens with this rental distribution? Thank you very much.
Thanks, thanks, Chris. And that's certainly a very central question. So I'll hand over to you, Kirsten, straight away.
You want me to answer before?
Well,
well, very briefly. We in our case studies, in some cases we could kind of figured out or had some information. We did not get hard data on it. I can't tell you this was what they paid and this was how it is distributed. Of course, this opens another stage of research if we would want to go into that subject. But yes, there is you asked about the differences in the kind of ejidos and the resources they have. Well, let me just see in the examples I show, for example, the profit will go directly to the actors involved. I mean, an ejidatario will rent his plot to the Menonita farmer, and he would have the rent, receive the rent. There was no distribution within the ejida.
But what happened with the common lands? What happened to the common lands in these common projects?
Well, they were all common lands, but they must have, I'm not too clear about, but they were parcels. So maybe they were treated as such, and that it may be a reason why they are not registered in the RAT, these transactions. So that was the solutions. Within this ejido, in the ejidos in Opelchen that were studied, there was a differentiation among the peasantry, because some can accumulate more land, renting also or buying from their other ejidatarios. And this happened. Also, there was, I remember one interview where somebody had 20 or 25, 30 hectares that he had bought and rented from other ejidatarios, mainly small peasants that do not have the resources to invest even in a little maize plot, or who were old or who need cash for something, sickness, etc., etc. So there is a differentiation example in Opelchen. Now, with the forest, we saw the example that here there was a division among the different actors between the ejidatarios, which was underlined by their ethnicity. I mean, the Raramu and the mestizos. And the mestizos would control the assembly. They would be the negotiators with the outside actors. They would have conflicts with the Raramuri. So there's I would say, a differentiation in the power, their power. But economically, I cannot answer this question. So of course, the Raramuris are generally the poor, but I guess I don't know what the status of the mestizo ejidatarios would be. Because I don't have that information. We did not focus on that information. Also, but as it turned out, it was a Raramuri settlement who benefited with the resources for an ecotourism project. Probably it is not probably it. I mean, it was said in the author underlined this. There's a lot of bribery and corruptions. For example, I didn't talk about the airport, but there was a huge also conflict around the airport, building the airport. It was the state government put money into it. There was corruption, bribery, etc., etc. Because in the case of the settlement, the leader, the spiritual indigenous Raramuri leader did accept the agreement with the hotel owners because he was bribed. But then when the population found out, he was thrown out of there. So that is why it's very difficult. You would have to another kind of study to focus on that kind of problems. In the urban case, well, maybe Clara, do you want to comment on that? Or you're not ready to do that?
Yeah. She's
You
going
know,
to
my
comment.
English is not too good, so I prefer you tell me maybe bad. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so in the urban, it was as I understand it, in the first step was that it was not only the developers contacting the ejido, it was also the middlemen from the Procuraduría Agraria and bureaucrat interests. You know, they convinced the ejidatarios that this was going to be a good business. And so here we have pollution, I would say. Obviously, the 5 council members who were to represent the interests of the ejidatarios and the whole ejido were, I'm sure they were bribed. You don't say it clearly, but it would be that. I mean, why else would they turn their backs on their fellow ejidatarios and their interests? Yes, a lot of obscure things happened in these transactions. In the case, I have no more to add to this. And I really don't know, Clara, where the ejidatarios got their resources from to pay for the costs of the case and the mobilizations and so on and so forth. But we can leave that to later. And then, for example, in the beach, in the case of beach, that was very conflict. And because in this development of the whole Caribbean beach area in Quintana Roo, it is a very, very long story, goes back to the 70s to the 80s. And here there were also the state bureaucracy was into the interest, defending the entrepreneurs. And of course, there has been presumably illegal moves, money, lots of money flowing between the bureaucracy, high bureaucracy. And I think a governor went to jail after he left the government for corruption and so on. And there was a lot of information in the press and in discussions. This from the 70s and till today, because they keep moving down. Well, yeah, as I say, it's not straightforward. And it goes on in Tulum now as it goes down south the shore. So it's not very clear. We have one clear case in an ejido family dispute, which is very interesting, and which between 2 brothers to have the right to the succession of the land. They for 10 years in the courts, and that seemed to be kind of mostly clean as you read it. I'm just mentioning this. I mean, I cannot go further. There is a differentiation within the peasantry, and there is a question I have later on, which is, well, what is the differentiation as farmers may be clear in the Opelchen, but in other cases, in the tourism, in the urban, in the beaches, etc., I don't see, I thought a little bit, I don't see, and I think we should discuss this among our colleagues also, that there is a group of peasants that can develop and grow and become a small capitalist farmer. What I see more is a whole, of course there may be, but I see the whole trend, not a differentiation of a peasantry, but more yes, dispossession of the lower group of the peasantry. But that would be a theoretical assumption. It may be happening. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because in a sense, I think in many countries where there are laws protecting rights to own land, privatization and capitalization takes place along lines that are not totally legal, and ownership and use rights do not follow the law. And so but whether that then leads to peasant differentiation or whether it leads to dispossession, of course, that's hugely important for the people involved as well. But instead of me talking, please, we open for questions, of course, and we do have 2 questions in the chat, and I've asked Enrique if he can just tell us those questions. And put them to you, Kirsten. And yes, over to you, Enrique.
Sure. Thanks, Jens. And thank you, Kirsten, for such a very interesting presentation. So we have 2 questions in the chat, and I have one of my own, if that's okay. So the first one comes from Carla Gras. She also thinks it's a very interesting presentation. So she's following on Chris' question on differentiation. And she wants to know the role played by non-ejidatarios in the process. Are they themselves differentiated? That's what Carla asks. Then we have the second question by Gerardo. He asks if you found... Gerardo? He asked if you found patterns around female ownership across ejidal cases.
Patterns around formal
female ownership, female ownership across ejidal cases, and my question is
let me just, I'm trying to write around female participation,
female ownership, I suppose.
Ownership. I'm sorry. Okay.
Ownership across your cases. So that's Gerardo's question, and mine is just I'm intrigued if you could elaborate a little bit more on the process of land commodification, kind of following from Jens's comment, the last comment. I can see the difference in terms of the law when it became sort of legally, the intention to commodify it legally. But it also appears from what you are saying that before the law, there was an active land market. So for me, that tells me commodification already happening, to the extent that land was sold and bought, informally, of course, by different actors. But I'm just curious about that trend of the process of land commodification, if you could say something, perhaps not so much on the impact of the law, but of market pressures.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Carla Gras, that is a very good question. What is the role of the non-ejidatarios? Because this population, which is often larger than the ejidatarios, even ejidatarios and their families, if you count them, of course, the next generation have no rights to land. But they're also a group that are not part of the ejidatarios family. They live in the residential center. They have small businesses. They have on-farm income, labor, etc., etc. They are completely excluded from the decisions of the ejido. And that is quite a problem. There is a legal figure for participation, which is a junta popular of a community, the popular junta meeting group, and this group can participate in decisions which are not competent to the ejido, such as who enters what transaction. All this I've been talking about. They can participate in the in decisions that about infrastructure, water, schooling, which corresponds to a community. But as far as it seems, the Junta Populares do not work very well within the Mexico's ejidos. So actually, if you look at the national level, and we have half of the territory under ejido and comunidades, and there are 5 million ejidatarios and comunidades, it's likely, well, theoretically or formally, it would be 5 million people deciding about half the area of the country. That also is a little bit strange. Well, formally, this would be it. So it is very necessary, and this is a big issue in our discussions, and also in the probably the suggestions to reform some articles of the Agrarian Law is to giving the non-ejidatarios more rights to participate in the governance of the community. One point which is very important is to have a generation shift in the for the ejidatarios, so that the property rights will go to the next generation, which means, if you want to have development projects, technological projects, even the decision making could be very important, because the average age of the ejidatarios in Mexico is 56, and a large proportion of them are 65s. So they live in the former world. So there are a lot of things that could be modified and could give more energy to the economy and to the governance of the ejidos that are on the table, but not really being formally, some are formally presented, but not taken into account yet. That was right. Yes. That was Carlos. Okay, Gerardo. The pattern around female ownership. Women own about around 27 to 30% of the rights in the ejidos, the land rights in the ejidos, of the whole bundle of rights are women. The way that women have access to land is mainly by inheriting the land from the spouse. That means that the women are also of age, and they do not normally, or generally, they do not take actual control of the land and the production, etc. They leave that, they hand it over to one of the family members, a male, mostly likely. So they are passive owners of ejidatarios, I would say. Now, this may be changing also. Women have legal rights with equity to men, and that comes from the 1970 reforms. But they don't follow them out because mainly of their age. It is interesting that you could make, you could look at the rights by age groups, but you have that's a secession. Because in the latter decades, young women are in the labor markets and have maybe income from other activities and provide money to their house, to the household. More and more you see in field work also, not total data, that they then they ask for, or they want a piece of land, mostly for housing. This is another problem. A lot of the ejidos are split up also so that the new generation can get land. This also happens on the parcel and even on the commons, and it's illegal. The female and the gender perspective is officially an important discourse. So, but things don't change on the ground, or they change very slowly. So if that more or less satisfies the answer, Gerardo, we can talk about it later. The third question, Enrique, is about the process of commodification. Well, there is a commodification process de facto. In all the cases of urban expansion, which there are other problems like I haven't talked about, when cities expand onto the periphery, well, land is commodified. For example, near Mexico City, not in the case I was talking about, but into other areas, and maybe also a case to talk about. Again, I'm Clara can talk about that. Of course, they sell cheaply, and the land immediately increases in value if a developer comes in. This has happened, for example, in Yucatan, the area, peri-urban area of Mérida. Mérida has become a very desirable place to live in for several reasons. And the city is expanding very quickly for the last 10 years and on ejido land, where the urbanizers and the politicians and all these people convince ejido, pay very little for the land per hectare. The people will really don't live off the land. They live off, the land is poor agriculture. They live off of farm income and so on, and they sell it. And then this value has been developed to middle class and high class urban developments. And it's just growing and growing. So there is a process of commodification. It is more, I think it's more complex on the common rural lands where enterprises like new energy, clean energy projects, like the windmills, which have been established in Oaxaca mainly, but also other places. But the Oaxaca case is most known and most disputed and most in the press. There's agreed to these 30 years leases for the establishment of the windmills. In order to do that, there have been very many cases and mobilizations from the ejidos, but also the same thing that has happened in the urban case, that within the ejidos, people become fractionated, and there are groups that are for one thing and for the other thing. So some are kind of closer to the entrepreneurs and the money that's flowing from the entrepreneurs that really want this business, millions and millions of dollars. So, but this you cannot, it would be a de facto commodification in another way, because at least for 30 years has an end to it. It will probably be continued. We don't know. But this has been a very violent area between the entrepreneurs, the ejido, within the ejido, et cetera, et cetera. So what is commodification final, what for, what is the surplus, and how is it divided? Well, I would say that it is not the big business for the ejidatarios. It may be for some of the ejidatario, namely leaders who become corrupt. So that would be a very general picture.
Great, thanks a lot, Kirsten. I think we can have a last round of questions now. Shapan, I see your hand is up. Will you start?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I may not have actually understood much of the presentation, so please forgive me if I've not got the point right. First of all, we're talking about, it seems to me, you've been talking about a scenario where on the one hand, there are capitalists from outside, like the Mennonites, who come in with high-tech agriculture. But also you were talking about differentiation processes which lead to complex outcomes. Now, assuming that, that is the rough nature of the situation that you've been describing, one question that I have is, did the Mennonites, who were obviously very commercial and very energetic and enterprising groups, you mentioned that they bought and they leased land, but I did not hear that there were any cases of coercive land grabs or land accumulation in that sense. So the first question is, did the Mennonites, these very enterprising capitalists from outside, did they operate only through market rules of the game? And to the extent that there was primitive accumulation in the sense of land transfers, whether in terms of leases or in terms of sale of property rights, these were non-coercive, market-based, voluntary transactions, number one. Number two, the differentiation among the ejidatarios, forgive me if I can't pronounce the term right, we see that there are instances of co-option. There are council members who are betraying the interest of their fellow members. Now, that is not very unusual. I mean, I've seen that with indigenous peoples elsewhere in the world, where the leadership kind of is co-opted, becomes part of the gravy train, gets a share of the bribes and so on. This in itself is nothing, unusual. So to the extent that you mentioned that some of them actually become quite rich, quite wealthy, and indeed some of them become small capitalists, are we dealing with a scenario where you have capitalists not only from the outside, like the Mennonites, but you have the emergence of a stratum of the indigenous groups, a privileged or powerful stratum, which actually becomes capitalists from inside? Are we dealing with a complex case in that sense? And my last question is, you talked about informal land transfers, which took place despite preventive measures in the law and so on. And you mentioned that these were guaranteed by local social understandings. But it seems that that did not always work out, because there were also several cases where you mentioned that there was disagreement and the parties went to court, and you talk about one developer becoming bankrupt and so on. So the question here is, if the local social understandings have not proved adequate to undergird contracts and transactions, has there been any move to formalize the institutional framework of these transactions going beyond local social understandings?
Thanks so much, Japan. Before we let Kirsten have a go at answering these important questions, can we just hear from Shreya if there are any questions from YouTube and the remaining questions as well here?
Thanks, Jens. So there's nothing on YouTube, but I think there are just a couple of comments on the chat. One is by Jeff Goodwin, who's had to leave, but he said that he was asking if greater differentiation between ejidos influenced broader land struggles in Mexico. So
You go slow, please.
Oh, sorry.
On the last question, on the question.
Yeah, has greater differentiation between ejidos influenced broader land struggles in Mexico? So demands around land redistribution and regulation. And have the reforms been successful in limiting the development of regional or national peasant or indigenous movements? Something neoliberals would celebrate, of course. So that was Jeff's question. There is a comment also that it's probably a reflection from their experience. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name, but it's a comment by someone who says that they live in the Chiapas and they think that in ejidos, the person who is making enough money is buying another ejidatarios land in order to increase their commercial production. So this is a kind of capitalist ejidatario. And I think if I can just sort of also throw in a broad, perhaps a slightly simplistic question into the mix, which is that I think of course, the rupture between what is legal and what is socially legitimate or illegitimate is, of course, very, it's hugely instructive and resonates with things in other parts of the world as well. What I was interested in asking you is, would you think it would be desirable for some of what is socially legitimate to also become legally acceptable, or does that rupture actually allow for some kind of a politics of negotiation around how land transactions are structured? So I think that's all, Jens. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Shreya. And so unfortunately, it is 2 minutes to 7 p.m. UK time now, so we haven't got much time left. But I'm sure we can run a bit over because these are important questions. But Kirsten, do you think you can aim at
I don't know.
brief answers, even though they're huge questions?
I was thinking I now have material for a new project.
Yeah, exactly. So
I don't know how. Well, very quickly and perhaps to Chopin, the Mennonites, and this was a very peaceful kind of agreements. There have been no struggles, violence, confrontations between the Mayan farmers and the Mennonites. And the Mennonites have been moving more and more over land. For example, at one point, they bought up parcels, so many parcels, that they finally made an ejido for themselves, a Mennonite ejido. They separated from the other ejido. One problem they do have is with the beekeepers, that is in the whole peninsula of Yucatan, as I said, is the major honey exporter to Europe, because it was found that there were residuals, what do you call it, from fertilizers in the honey that was exported. And this has led to, this is another subject, but this led to a long process of even a formal process between the receivers of the exports in Europe and the Mayan farmer beekeepers and the Mennonitas and other enterprises that would use these fertilizers. And finally, after years of the use of certain chemical inputs are forbidden in the whole peninsula of Yucatan to protect the bees. So it's not all losses. All losses in this. So no, there have been no coercive problems. It's, I don't know, we would say, is it they're among farmers? It's not a win-win situation, but both sides are profiting. Okay. Your questions are, there's a little bit more to it, but if I have to hurry, then there's a question, the question on informal transfers, will they be, that may not, will they ever be, some of them are not adequate. Yes. And that is, for example, the case of the urban development project, the ejidos had to change their ways. They had to learn to deal on the other norms. And that was one of the problems. They could no longer, they had to go into civil courts, not only the agrarian court, they went to the civil court because it was now an enterprise. And they didn't really understand it, and they didn't have the resources or the same expertise, lawyers, etc., that the enterprise had. So no, this is part of the complexity and the contradictions. I don't know. The answer, can these social norms become part of the legalization? Maybe some, if you give more liberty or release some of these rules to the ejidos themselves. This is could be a problem of governance, have a broader context for the local governance on the ejidos. That perhaps that could be kind of one way of reforming. But this would have to go through the whole legislative process up to the agrarian law, and there are no formal projects in Congress. But there is two projects for reforming the law, but it does not have any content in this way. And I have Shapa, and I had some other question. Oh, somebody who's not present. That is, has this reform Mexico experience broader land struggles, mobilizations, developing national movements? Yes, but there are other issues. There has been the big issue of protecting maize from MGOs. And it has just been accepted that Mexico will not accept is forbidding the use of MGOs or is it in English, GMOs? I get
GMOs, yes.
GMOs, sorry, are forbidden to use in Mexico because it will contaminate the biodiversity and the original seeds. So that has been solved. There's another strong moving for forbidding glyphosates. Will you translate? Yes. This herbicide, glyphosates.
Glyphosate.
Right, okay. So that's a strong movement. There's a strong movement also to protect the seeds of the maize and the original biodiversity. But on the question of broader movements and struggles on the land, we have some examples in the north in mining communities where mines have been developing very rapidly for open air fracking projects. And there's a strong movement in those areas by the ejidatarios and the population in general to stop this. There's, well, right now there's a project in the proposal in the Congress that has to do with all the legislation on energy, oil, etc. And I can't, that would be good. And you had to invite somebody else to talk about that.
Maybe Kirsten, maybe this is a good point to stop. There's more in these questions, I know, but we are running over, and people are very, I'm sure they're hanging on because they're interested, but there's a limit to how long we should stretch it, I think. So,
Okay, because I think some of these questions deserve another seminar.
well, some of these questions,
And not by me, because that's
in a sense, they're very general, because it's about the issues that we are really interested in, all of us, isn't it? What is actually going on with capitalism in agriculture? How is it working? So thanks to you, Kirsten, for this excellent, interesting presentation that really, I think we could see with the questions really also pushed our thinking. Thanks to Chris for asking some penetrating questions to get us all going, and to everyone else for being here and taking part and making this into another excellent session.
Just one little comment. I was very glad to be able to share this, and I think that we need to share these problems more internationally, because we are just look at Mexico, and probably we could have some interchange with other.
I agree, and it is. I mean, this terrible pandemic at least has done that to us, that we have become more used to spending time on Zoom discussing, and that is at least one good thing. So let us continue doing that also if this ever stops. That said, our next session in 1 week's time, Thursday next week, 4th of November, is actually a mixed joint or face-to-face seminar as well as a webinar. So we are trying to experiment with forms so we can both get the intensity of the small group in a room and the global webinar. So we're trying that out next weekend, where we have Demet Dindler from University of Sussex coming to SOAS to talk about transforming agricultural markets through institutional design and ethnography of Turkish cut flower auctions. So, but that is next week. For now, all that's left is to say thank you to everyone, and hopefully see you anon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.